Hey everyone, John from Bike Fit Advisor. So in this video, we're going to tackle how to set up a new bike just like your old one. So on occasion, I have clients that I've done a fitting on in the past, and they've come in now with a new bike that they say has been set up exactly like their old one, but it just doesn't feel right. And so after we take some measurements, we realize that it's actually not the same setup. And I think a lot of people struggle with getting the contact points in exactly the same position, transferring the fit from one bike to another. So I want to go over how to do that right now. So I think what happens a lot of times where people get it wrong is they go ahead and they just get the saddle height set the same, and then they measure from the saddle to the bars and make sure that's the same, and they kind of call it good. But there's actually a few more steps that we need to do. So for the time being, we're just going to assume that the new frame and the old frame have the same geometry. It just makes things simpler for what we're going to do, but we can talk at the end a little bit about what to do when this isn't the case. And the first thing we want to do is we do want to normalize the saddle height. So we're going to measure from the center of the bottom bracket to the top of the saddle. Now, when we're measuring to the top of the saddle, I think it works best to pick a point on that saddle that we're going to take all of our measurements from. You can just call it like a reference point. And what I like to do is to actually pick a point on the saddle, and I usually start with a place where the saddle itself is about 70 millimeters wide or so. That's going to be somewhere in the middle of the saddle. So if I grab my tape measure here and I measure about 70 millimeters wide or so, that's going to be about here. So I'm going to take all my measurements for this from this point, saddle height, and then the reach measurements that we're going to do in a little bit here as well. So that's the first place to start. We're going to measure center of the bottom bracket to that point. Now we have one more thing we really want to do with the saddle, and it's to make sure that the saddle's fore aft is the same as our old bike. What we're most concerned about is to make sure that the saddle is the same distance behind the bottom bracket. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our point on our saddle and drop a plumb line from it straight down, and then measure the horizontal distance from the bottom bracket to that plumb line. If we do these two things, it'll normalize and get our saddle position in the same place. We'll have the right height, and we'll have our hips in the right position behind our feet. Next, we're going to take two measurements for the handlebars. We're going to measure from our point on the saddle, our reference point, to the center of the bar, and then we're also going to make a direct line measurement to the base of the hood, right up against where it kicks up, right about here. And so what that looks like is we're going to measure from our point on the saddle all the way forward to that handlebar, and we're going to make sure we bisect the center of that handlebar right there. We can also, like I mentioned, make we can take a line from our point out to the base of those hoods as well, right there. Now this can get a little bit tricky because we might find that there's some differences with both of these numbers. And this is one of the things I think a lot of people miss. What they find is that they've been able to get the measurement from the saddle to the handlebar the same, but then what they find out that it's actually a different reach to the hoods on the new bike. And this may be because the new bike has a handlebar on it that has, more reach or less reach to it, and that's going to change that distance. So we kind of have to consider how you're going to ride this bike most of the time. If you spend most of your time on the tops or on the corners here, then you might stick with this stem measurement as sort of your default. But if you're like most people and you spend most of your time out near the hood somewhere, then the hood measurement is the one that we probably want to put a little bit more weight on. Now, the last thing we need to do is we want to make sure we get the bar height set correctly. And so we want to understand on our existing bike how much higher or lower the saddle is than the handlebars. And I like to measure to the hood on this. So we're looking for our handlebar drop. Usually on road bikes it's referred to as handlebar drop because the handlebars are generally below the saddle. That's not always the case, of course. But in this case, what we would do is we want to have that measurement. How much higher is the saddle than the handlebars? And I've seen a lot of people struggle with a level, and they're trying to hold it up and hold it level from the top of the saddle and measure down. But the easiest way to do this one is just to drop another plumb line, measure from the top of the saddle straight down to the ground, take that measurement, and then take another measurement from the base of the hood here down to the ground, and subtract those two, and that'll give you your bar drop. So you'll notice when we started, we got the saddle position, the height and the fore aft set, and we just, that is pretty much done. We're gonna have, we leave that in place. So that means we have our hips in the same spot as on the old bike. Then we make our appropriate measurements and adjustments by taking the measurements then from the saddle to our handlebars. So just a couple of notes about this. We do need to consider the length of the crank arms, especially when we're initially starting with the saddle height. If the crank arm lengths are different between the new and the old bike, that'll have to be accounted for. So if you're moving to a 175 millimeter crank from 172.5, then of course you're going to need to make sure that the saddle is 2.5 millimeters roughly, so a little bit lower, and opposite for when you're moving to a shorter crank. Now, doing things in this sequence will help you if the geometry between the two frames is not identical. It will, to a pretty strong degree, help you account for that, because we're really just trying to get your contact points in the same location in space. And usually small differences between frames will not be a big deal. You'll be able to account for it with small component changes. For instance, if the new bike has a slightly longer effective top tube or a longer reach measurement, then usually we can account for that with either a slightly shorter stem or maybe a bar with a little less reach, or a combination of those. But when there are large differences in the two frames, then this can be really difficult and sometimes impossible to correct for. And using this ahead of time before you buy a new bike, by going through this sequence with the new bike you're looking at, you can actually use this to help you figure out, is this bike gonna fit me? Is this size correct for me? If you go through the first points, get your saddle set up in position in space, and you start taking measurements to the handlebars, and it becomes clear like you're gonna need some very drastic stem, like you're gonna need a 60 millimeter stem on there, that might tell you that, well, this might not be the right size for me. And likewise, if you go through the mechanics of all this and you realize, I'm going to really have to have a lot of spacers under the stem, and I'm going to have a stem with a lot of rise, 25 degrees of rise, in order to attain the same bar height. Well, that might tell you again that maybe this frame is not suited well. So going about it this way will really, from the ground up, help us make sure that we're hitting our contact points putting them in the right locations. Let me know down in the comments below if you've ever run into this when you've gotten a new bike or you've had measurements transferred over. There are, of course, pieces of equipment out there to help you measure these things, and these can be useful, but most people, I find, if you just take a little bit of time and a tape measure, it'll take you a long way. So, thanks everyone. I will see you next time.